Thoughts on what is happening with federal employees?
Yeah, I think unions have been a really important part of upholding the dignity of work and the ability to get paid a living wage for real work. I think that is a cornerstone of our economy, that you ought to get paid for the work that you do. And I think it's also a part of upholding work that is worth paying for. You know, I mean, I get pretty frustrated about how often my husband, walks through his work boots and just, you can't find work boots that last longer than a year anymore. And the idea that I don't want to see a kid somewhere else exploited for a cheap pair of work boots. I want to be able to buy things that were made here with skill and pride that uphold the nobility of craft and commitment to that. And unions have been a really critical part of that. One of my brothers is a federal employee at the VA, and I was pretty frustrated to see the way that federal employees were scapegoated. We want systemic reform. We want to have an efficient government, but randomly scapegoating a federal employee does not build a better machine. It's just pulling bolts and nuts off randomly. We want to see a more efficient machine, and a lot of times those employees that were scapegoated are exactly the ones who could tell you where the inefficiency lies. I remember talking to some of my oyster growers, and they were like, well, they fired the person that does the water quality testing, but apparently they still have a comms director because they're still tweeting. And so what's your priority here? And it's not about a upper management class being able to kind of protect themselves and their own job security at the expense of people who are working. It's a balance of the work boots to the clipboards, and saying that we want to see our federal dollars being used to do the thing itself. And I'd say that goes also, I was talking to the Port of Chinook, they were telling me that 40% of the cost of dredging was permitting. What are we doing? What are we doing here? When that dredging not happens means that we have more semis on the road. When that dredging not happens means that we're cut off from emergency response in any kind of water, high water event. And a lot of those federal employees are exactly the people who could point to you where the inefficiency is and how to build a better machine. These are civil servants that want to do a good job and have gotten wrapped around the bureaucratic axle, not by their own choosing, but because often, like Mark Twain said, I would have wrote a shorter letter, but I didn't have enough time. They would have wrote a better bill, but they didn't listen to people. And so having a legislative process where people who've done the job are at the table and have a local lens into how this is going to be implemented. I was at the Clark County Jail talking to their corrections officers. They told me, you know that the average life expectancy of a corrections officer is 58 years old. They have a suicide rate 7 times higher than the general population. And it's underreported because they don't get the insurance pay. And I was talking to them about what they need. Like, how can I support you? And they kept telling me what their detainees need. They were like, well, look, if I can give that detainee a roll of toilet paper, my whole relationship is going to change with them. If I can't give them the roll of toilet paper, I might get ejaculated on later. I wish I was joking, but that's the reality. And they point directly to, this was a little bit of field, but they said you could draw a direct line to when they shut down beds at Western State Hospital to when they started having schizophrenics in the general population, and a real shift in what they were experiencing in law enforcement. And so making sure that our civil servants have the ear of lawmakers and that we are actually pursuing the regulatory and procedural reform that empowers the people to do the job they signed up to do. We're asking them to do the wrong job. We're asking them to fill out paperwork or to, send a nice report to someone, and that's not what they wanted to do in the first place. They want to be able to give somebody a roll of toilet paper when they ask for it. And so affirming that agency and their virtue in being able to do that work is a really core part of getting, having pride and agency in these jobs and getting the most value out of our tax dollars. So those are the kinds of things that I'm looking at when I'm thinking about how we support federal employees I was first in line to very clearly explain to the administration that Bonneville is a self-funding agency. Randomly firing people at Bonneville, firing machinists at Bonneville is not a good long-term solution to having reliable power, and getting those, working to get those reversed, and that we're not going to have timber sales if we don't have people to execute those sales at the Forest Service. We can't just rely on tech bros to tell us, who to randomly fire. It's looking under the hood and thinking critically about the kinds of jobs we create, where we've developed inefficiency in the system itself.
Okay, next question comes from Mel from Skamania. With the cost of today's housing, my own kids can't afford a house. U.S. property owners that are in the SMA, Special Management Area of the Gorge, can't even build an ADU on our own property. Can you talk with the feds and Gorge Commission about us being able to build on our own land? Thank you.
Yeah, there are so many crazy stories. I think we all personally know many, many stories about, somebody not being able to place the windows because a hiker might see a glare, or having to paint the backs of signs, or all these things that, don't, they make sense on paper, but in practice they don't. And I have been concerned that, I don't have a problem with, nice houses being built, multi-million-dollar houses being built per se, but it is very concerning to me to hear that, the regulatory moat that builder might be able to surmount is something that people who are trying to do a starter home can't. We need starter homes. We need housing. This is one of the primary ways that people move wealth generationally, and affirming our ability to build homes for ourselves, to have security. Because I will tell you, the alternative is somebody living in an RV in the Gifford. That's what's happening. And then they torch it, and then it's a $7,000 bill to get it out of there, if you can find a wrecker to come get it. But so there are real environmental and economic and just social and cultural costs to that a system that is not correctly sized. So some of the things that I've been thinking about is not just within the special management area, but broadly. I told you, Dean and I, we spent $120,000 to build our house. That's like 1,800 square feet. It's a nice house, not to brag, but we did a good job. And I've heard reports about, the average cost of a federally involved affordable housing unit being 3 or 4 times that at times. And I guess 3 times, 2 or 3 times. And so I think that my conception of what's kind of going on is that, knowingly or unknowingly, people sort of stumble into a very restrictive zoning and permitting process. And that scarcity does help their asset appreciate. It means that your house is more valuable if there are less houses around. And then they come to the feds and they say, hey, we don't have any affordable housing. Can you help us out? And then the feds come in and they help build housing. And it's a very slow, arduous process. What I've been working on, some legislation that I've been working on is saying, you've got to clean up your own act. You've got to make it easier for people to build. And I'm not going to tell you how to do that. I'm not going to tell you that it's about, parking requirements or whatever it is. You figure out how to get there, city or county. You figure out how to get there. And when you elevate, when you build more housing, you move up in the line for those federal dollars. So let the private market, let families like ours build more housing. One thing that we have going for us in Washington State that's pretty cool, I learned this is very unusual, is our prescriptive engineering standards for owner-builder. So Dean and I didn't have to go to an engineer to get our plans stamped. You could just look up the book and say what the size of the header needs to be. And that probably saved us $10,000, significant amount. And so trying to apply that and say, are there more ways that we can have prescriptive engineering standards, more agency, more shop class in junior high, more ability to make our own housing. I don't think that everyone's going to go out and build their own house, but I know that every housing unit brings down the cost of everybody else's housing. It takes pressure off the rental market. It gives us more housing stock, and that's a really important part of our identity as Americans. That agency to do the thing itself, and not have to wait for help to do it, but to say, where is the system breaking down? Get that in order. Make it easier for people to build a house and build generational wealth that way. A family's budget is, cash is fungible, right? Like, we can go in and we can subsidize childcare all day long, and there's strong arguments that there's some good things there. But it's also true that if you allow a family to move from paying rent to paying a mortgage and owning the thing itself, that extra $200 a month means that they have more money to buy real food, they have more money to pay for childcare, all the other things. And so helping people build their own wealth, because their household budgets are fungible. So how do we get more value out of what we're doing and making sure that people have self-determination in this country and the ability to get what they want. If they work hard, you pay attention in shop class, you've got an opportunity here to build something worth having. So those are some of the things I think about around housing and how we get a seat at the table. I guess the last thing I'll say, sorry, but within that, there's been a lot of emphasis in building code around really expensive forms of lowering the carbon footprint. Like, you've got a triple glazed argon-filled window. That's a pretty expensive window. But the traditional ways of building that we know about, you put an appropriate eave on the house. That roof is going to last, that house is going to last a lot longer. You put the long side facing south, you're going to need less money for heating. And so trying to get more space at the table to affirm the things that we already know in the trades about how you build a house that lasts, 80 years, that is something that you can heat, that you can cool. It shouldn't just be only about the research. It shouldn't just be about, tax credits for a $40,000 heat pump. It ought to also be about, what else saves a lot of energy is putting a skirt on a mobile home. It doesn't cost $40,000. It costs like $2,000. And that person, that family is a lot more likely to be on a fixed income than somebody that's able to go in and drop $40K on a heat pump. So thinking about these kinds of permitting and building codes and ways that we can build more value in, and I think that comes from having people out of the trades at the table when these rules are being set.
David from Kansas asks, are you hopeful in the prospects for cooperation across the aisle in Congress as the Trump administration goes into its final years?
I think there really is a pretty profound realignment of politics in this country, and this is an event that's put on with. This is an official event. We're using tax dollars to be here, and so I can't talk a whole lot about campaigns or anything like that. But I will say that you will hear similar things out of both camps in certain avenues. Environmentalism is the same way. A lot of the things that you want out of salmon habitat restoration, that's also just having a good sewer system. It's public works also. There are some shared interests there that can mobilize and animate a different kind of agenda. I think it's important that we are thinking with real humility and curiosity to each other, like, what is the thing here that people are, that we really want? Like, I was getting a ton of letters about Hunter Biden's laptop for a long time, but I will say, you lift the hood open on that one, and I think what people are really talking about is that your last name shouldn't determine your experience with the justice system, that the right lawyers should, so they're talking about, judicial reform, and that's something we all want. We all want a fairer system, and so if you lift the hood open and you figure out what is the shared value here, and don't get sidetracked by, the proper nouns or the celebrity or the culture politic, the culture wars here. But like, is there a shared germ that we agree about here? And trying to animate that. Yeah, I mean it is. There's a lot of conversation around, campaign reform, campaign finance reform, all of that. A lot of times I think that those ads wouldn't be so effective if people had time to think, if they weren't all working 3 jobs, if they knew their neighbors, if we had more community, those ads are a lot less persuasive. And so we're often trying to just litigate the thing that we don't like and figuring out why did we get that thing in the first place and how do we get more of what we want. Knowing our neighbors, knowing what the local issues are, knowing the history on an issue, having deeper relationships, that humility and curiosity could animate a very different kind of politics. But I will tell you, the consultant industrial complex does not benefit from that. It is going to take all of us listening to our neighbors more. It takes thinking about the values that people are what's really going on, what do we really want, and not what is just a gut reaction. I was pretty, it's a pretty tough thing to see those Medicaid cuts passed by one vote. I'm not gonna lie, I was pretty thinking about, you feel like breaking furniture in a cloakroom, because people who said they would never vote for it voted for it, and but you gotta keep giving people the opportunity to be who they really are, and you believe them when they tell you that. You give them the opportunity to be a different, to be a better version. It's about really. It's so easy for people to put on their politician skin and never show you who they are, and to attack them on that line. But I think trying to build when a colleague's wife dies, you send them groceries. It doesn't matter what side of the aisle they're on. That is the human thing to do. And so trying to animate that spirit, not holding on to a grudge, I think that's a really necessary thing in DC right now.
Anna from Stevenson asks, there was just an article in the New York Times about the dangers of smoke for Forest Service firefighters. The Forest Service won't support masks because it makes the firefighters slower. Can you do anything to protect our firefighters?
Yeah, so I'm co-leading on Tim's Law, and that's a guaranteed $20 per hour for wildland firefighters. These fires are getting a lot more dangerous. They're hotter. And these are, there's one of the things that I've heard about from firefighters I've talked with is we know that these forever chemicals, these PFAS, the flame retardants are not good things. How many more billions of dollars do we need to spend on researching how bad they are? Can we just get a wool-based base layer? Can we just get the thing that we know is better in the now, in the right now? What are the concrete steps we could take? There are things like, I know that Portland Fire Department, they are using steam rooms after really gross fires. They've found that you can lower the contaminant levels in your blood by getting out and just steaming in a steam room. There are lower scale interventions that people used to know and used to use more commonly, reanimating that. More latitude to spend that budget in a way that makes sense for the department. Some of the other things I've heard that I've been really concerned about, out of the LA fires, they saw a real shortage of fire apparatus. I heard this from Rob Gordon, the former mayor of Bucota. He was a volunteer firefighter from when he was 15 years old until he died last year of stomach cancer very suddenly, leaving 2 little kids behind. He and I have been working together on a fire grant, They had been waiting in line for a fire truck for years. Two companies, I think it's two companies, now own 70% of fire equipment manufacturing in this country. And you're going to be waiting in line a long time for that truck to arrive. So having more diversity in the manufacturing, more latitude in the refurbishment of that equipment, unwinding the barriers to entry of making this stuff. We need more players. We need more people with the ability to enter the market. It's just. I mean, it's also just true. Like it would. Looking at the new WUI standards for home building, it's like there's a lot of plastic in houses you're recommending now. Like that's not a good thing. Getting back to real wood, traditional building standards. That is another thing that is going to bring a lot. We can get out ahead of the curve on some of the toxic exposure that our firefighters are seeing, in ways that make sense for us here locally.
Mary from Stevenson asks, if we have billions of dollars for tax breaks for billionaires and corporations, why don't we have money for veterans benefits and a living wage for active duty military?
Amen. Amen. I think that was a pretty, that's the thing about the last budget bill that was passed, is that it was pretty firmly oriented around taking stuff from the bottom 10%. And I will say, I also want to see, I'm not here for fraud, waste, and abuse. I want those dollars to go where they really ought to go. But the budget bill is just oriented around not reforming those systems, but just taking away stuff from the bottom 10% and moving it to the top 0.1%. And ignoring 89.9% of the economy is a really dumb way to run that economy. It added that budget added also, as Mary pointed out, it added $4 trillion to the deficit. That is $13,000 per family. And they're already saying that the ultra wealthy aren't going to be the ones that are paying it. So who's going to pay it? It's going to be us. And I don't know. I worked for a living. It wasn't shareholder dividends. It wasn't the stock market. And to say that we're going to be the ones footing this bill is pretty enraging. There were some good things in the bill. I think extending the middle class tax cuts was a good thing. But we didn't have to add $4 trillion to the debt to do that. We didn't have to walk away from seniors and Medicare and Medicaid and advanced Social Security insolvency to do that. And I worked pretty hard to try and get in there and say, let's get a deal that's bipartisan. And I was rejected all 4 times. I sent 4 letters to the speaker. I didn't get a letter back. But I'm going to continue to put my hand out there and say that our national security matters. That it matters that we are having lower levels of recruitment for the military. That you ought to be able to support a family. You ought to be able to have. You shouldn't be on hold with the VA for 12 hours when we're putting this kind of money into it, and you put your life into service. So looking for that kind of systemic reform, looking for ways that we can affirm the dignity and necessity, and our service members deserve to be fairly paid while they're in the service, and they deserve to have this, the resources that they earned when they get out of the military. And I had a roundtable the other day with a group of veterans, and man, it's tough. It's tough. I think that if what you want to do is go after the college track after you leave the service, that's great. You should be able to do that. Also, we need to talk about how we have the ability to go into the trades, to start your own business, to build a house with your VA benefits. The loneliness epidemic is rampant across our country, and it is a crisis. People getting out of the military who are used to tight communities, who get out and they're just on their own suddenly. Loneliness is not a psychological disorder, but it can lead to one pretty quickly. And so it can't just be oriented around a system that addresses things when they've reached a crisis point. It's got to be about how do you build community, how do you unwind that loneliness epidemic before it reaches a crisis point. So, continuing to chip away and find every avenue we can. I will also say I really got pretty upset about hearing what happened here in Skamania County, where we lost our transportation for veterans with 13 days of notice. Veterans have been waiting in line for 8 months for an appointment at the VA with a specialist, and then with 13 days notice, you're going to lose that transportation. There's not a bus coming out here, friends. I mean, and if you were like 5 minutes late for some of those appointments, it's gone. After you've been waiting, 8 months. Veterans who aren't able to get in, so I was, fighting for reauthorization and expansion. One of the problems here in Skamania County, I will say, that precipitated that is during COVID, we had so many more people move out here. And so we went from being considered highly rural to just rural. And it was like by a fraction of a person that happened, that shift happened. And we lost access to medical transportation for our veterans with almost no warning. Very glad to see the VSO, finally get a VSO in Skamania County, Veteran Service Officer in Skamania County, to have more connection with those relationships. But we've got to do better. It is not the same thing. Having a mobile clinic show up once in a blue moon in East Lewis County is not the same thing as having a clinic. So having the precursors of health, like community and housing and real food, and also having access to health care, and being able to use those benefits you've used. But it was pretty disturbing to see that disregarded in the last budget bill.
And for our final question of the evening, Michael from Vancouver asks, how does our nation have a conversation on the need for character in our politics?
That is a really good question, and I think a very necessary one. And I think, when the House was, I represent 760,000 people. At most districts, around 800,000 people. And it is harder to know your representative, to judge their character. This is my 18th in-person town hall since being elected 2.5 years ago. I think really being present and available and going to your district and being unafraid of being seen for who you are, that's a really important thing. And not asking for, it's not about a focus group or a think tank figuring out how you should describe yourself. It's about being in community with each other and reinvigorating a deliberative democracy where we know each other and talk about the things that matter to us. I've gotten some flack. I'm the only Democrat and was the only woman for a long time going to one of the Bible studies in the House. And, I don't think that, I firmly believe in the separation of church and state. I also think that it's a really difficult place to be, and it's really important to be in community with each other, with members of Congress who are, trying to not get divorced and who want to be good parents and who are committed to an external value system. I'm there because I need more Jesus, not because I need more politics, but these Bible studies will often devolve